Here's a question a lot of students never stop to think about. How old is Singapore really? Most people hear one date again and again, 1819. It is assumed that's where the story begins. But in this video, we're going to zoom out and see that Singapore's history actually stretches further back. And once you see that bigger picture, a lot of textbook questions become much easier to answer. So let's start with the key question. Did Singapore only start in 1819? The short answer is no. 1819 is important, of course. But if you only memorize that one date, you miss the earlier background that gives the story meaning. And in history, that earlier background is often exactly where the marks are hiding. This matters because exam questions don't always ask things in the simplest way. Sometimes they ask about early Singapore, or whether Singapore was important before 1819. If your answer is just one date and one name, it will feel too thin. But if you understand the earlier story, you can explain your ideas much more clearly and score more confident. By the end of this video, I want you to remember three things. First, what Temasek was. Second, how historians know it existed. And third, why Singapore's location made it useful as a port of call. If you lock in those three ideas, you'll already have a strong answer structure for this topic. Let's begin with step 1, Temasek. This is the part that helps us see that Singapore did not suddenly appear in 1819. Before that date, this island already had a place in the region's story. So instead of imagining a total beginning in 1819, think of it as the start of a new chapter in a much longer history. One of the biggest mistakes students make is imagining that Singapore began from absolutely nothing, but that's not accurate. The island already had a name, and it already had a role. It may not have looked anything like modern Singapore, but it was not just an empty spot waiting for history to begin. Earlier records mention a place called Temasek, in the same area as modern Singapore. That matters because it shows us this island was already known to people in the region. So when historians talk about early Singapore, they are not inventing a story from nowhere. They are working from names and clues found in older sources. Temasek was not a huge modern city with skyscrapers and container ships. It was much smaller. But it still mattered because it functioned as a small trading port in the Malay world. That means people came through, goods moved through, and the island had a purpose in regional trade even before the famous events of 1819. So what did ships actually do here? They could stop to rest, to trade, and to resupply. In other words, this was a useful stopping point during longer journeys. And that simple idea is important because it helps explain why a small place could still have value, even if it was not the biggest or richest port in the region. Try to picture the scene in your mind. No Marina Bay, no tall buildings, no city skyline. Instead, think of a smaller coastal settlement with boats coming in, traders unloading goods, and people living and working near the shore. It was not modern Singapore yet, but it was definitely not nothing. That's the key image you want to keep in your head. Now comes the next important question. How do we know Temasek really existed? After all, nobody was filming videos back then. This is where historians do their real work. They gather sources, compare evidence, and make careful inferences. So instead of guessing, they build a picture of the past from clues that have survived. This is a really important habit in history. Historians do not just make things up. They study sources, look for clues, and ask what those clues suggest. Then they form an inference. That word, inference, matters a lot because it means reaching a careful conclusion based on evidence, not just on opinion or imagination. The first kind of evidence is written records. These can come from nearby kingdoms, traders, travelers, or official writers. When different texts from different places mention a port in this area, that becomes a strong clue. A single source might be weak on its own, but several written references, pointing in the same direction, become much more convincing. So the key idea here is matching clues. If different written records all point to a place in this area, historians begin to see a pattern, and patterns matter. In history, when several separate pieces of evidence support the same idea, your confidence in that idea becomes stronger. That is how historians gradually connect the dots. The second kind of evidence is maps and travel accounts. Old maps may use different spellings, and travel writings may describe places in older ways, but they still give useful information. If the location matches the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula, and the description sounds like a trading stop, historians use that as another piece of the puzzle. The Third kind of evidence comes from objects found in the ground. Historians and archaeologists study things like pottery, coins, and beads. If those objects come from different regions, such as China, India, or other parts of Southeast Asia, that suggests trade links. In simple terms, these objects show that people and goods were moving through this place. And this should sound familiar, because it's actually the same skill you use in source-based questions. You look at the source, ask what it suggests, and then infer what was happening. So this topic is not just about memorizing facts. It's also training you to think like a historian, using evidence to support your conclusion. Now we move to step 3, why this place mattered. This is where the idea of a port of call becomes very useful. Once you understand that term, you can explain why Singapore's location gave it value even before it became the better-known port connected with later history. A port of call is simply a place where ships stop during a longer journey. They may stop to rest, load or unload goods, get supplies, or prepare for the next part of the trip. So it doesn't have to be the final destination to matter. Even a stop along the way can become important because of where it is. Here's a modern analogy to make that easier. Think about a long-haul flight. You might fly from Japan to Europe and stop in Singapore in the middle. That stopover airport is useful, even if it isn't your final destination. In the same way, a port of call was a useful stop for ships on longer journeys across regional trade routes. So why was Singapore useful? The answer is location. It sat near busy sea routes and close to a narrow sea passage used by many ships. That made it convenient. If you are in the right place on the map, people keep passing by you. And if ships keep passing by, your port can become valuable. By the early 1800s, trade routes were becoming even more important, and stronger powers were paying more attention to strategic locations. That helps explain why Singapore became important again in a new way. So when you reach 1819 in the story, you should not think of it as history starting from zero. Think of it as a place with earlier importance entering a new phase. Let's lock in the 3 most important points. First, Singapore did not begin from nothing in 1819, because the island was already known earlier as Temasek. Second, it was useful because of its position as a port of call near busy sea routes. Third, historians know this through sources such as written records, maps, and archaeological objects. Here's your exam tip. If you get a question asking whether Singapore was important before 1819, you can turn these ideas into a short peel paragraph. Make your point, give evidence such as Temasek and the sources, explain why its location mattered, and then link back to the question. That already gives you a much stronger answer than just writing one date. So here's the big takeaway. Don't just memorize 1819 by itself. Think Temasek, think port of call, and think sources. Those 3 ideas help the whole topic make sense. In the next video, we'll go one step further and look at how early Singapore was connected to the wider region and the wider world.